Okay, so basically I will be giving the Econ 208 review. So important things before we start. It will be recorded and posted so people can go have a look at that later if they want to. Also very important for you guys is that it doesn't cover everything in your econ classes. I know there are 4 sections for the class. So it's important that you guys remember that obviously I won't be able to cover everything in these 2 hours. And also many of you have other sections, like I think some of you covered chapter 17, 18, 32, 33, which I won't be covering. So I'll be covering chapters 1 to 12 and 16. So I think that's like the core of most your sections. Also, another thing, if you guys think I'm talking too fast, want me to clarify something, please don't hesitate to like say anything and then I can clarify. Also, most of the things I put in the slides, since I'm going to be posting it online, I won't be like mentioning most of the formulas and definitions since your guys' exam is open book. So I don't really see the point in me spending a lot of time on that. And then obviously if the questions are pertinent to the slides, go ahead, stop me, interrupt me. But if they're not, if they're like extra stuff, maybe wait till the end. That way it'll go a bit faster for everyone and maybe it won't take the full 2 hours. Oh, weird. So first I will go over key ideas from chapters 1 and 2. So basically one of the key ideas from chapters 1 and 2, since economics is the study of how you allocate scarce resources, opportunity cost is a big one because obviously every decision someone takes will involve an opportunity cost. And so this is basically the value of the next best alternative. So basically when you're at the supermarket, if you buy a bar of chocolate, you could have bought an apple or a banana. So it's the idea that like if the apple one was the second best after the chocolate, what was that cost that you didn't get the apple? So here you can it can be portrayed with a budget line, for example. So obviously this would be the whole budget you can allocate to, let's say, 2 goods. So when you look at the budget line, here I put the example of this one, I think it's from your textbook, kilometers of road repair and kilometers of new bicycle paths. And basically from going C to B, you'd be giving up 3 kilometers of road repair to get 6 kilometers of bicycle path. So in this sense, to get from C to B, you'd be giving up 3 to get 6. So the opportunity cost would be like a half kilometer of road repair for each kilometer of bicycle path you get. Is that clear with everyone? If there's an issue, just put in the chat and I should be able to see that. This is there, like hopefully that's clear enough. You guys can go over that in your own time and you should have class notes from it. So it should be pretty clear with the textbook as well. The PPBs in chapter 1 and 2 are also very clear for this. So basically a PPB is all the production possibilities that are possible for a whole economy. So when you look at an economy, to be able to see like an economy can produce on its production possibilities, and that way it's maximizing what it can produce in the economy. So points A, B, C are maximizing. You can also produce within this whole PPB because obviously these are all attainable combinations. You can be producing a D. But obviously D is not as efficient as B, since from D to B, you'd be increasing the amount of consumption goods and the amount of investment goods. So obviously being on this curve is the best because you're maximizing your production considering what you have. So basically these are all attainable. E and F are not attainable. So basically that is beyond what your economy can actually produce. So this goes way beyond. I'm seeing the chat going. I mean, okay, because I can see the chat, but I have to go look at it. So if people do want to ask a question, can you just like turn your microphone on and ask it? Maybe I think that might be easier. Unless, are you guys all muted?
Hi.
Oh, okay, amazing. Yeah, if you guys do have a question, please interrupt me because like the chat is like above, so I have to go look at it actively. So the video will be posted. It will be posted by the ESA. I think if you look on the Facebook, I'll make sure it's posted, like the link to anything. And productive efficiency is on the curve. Yes, I will look at that a bit more in depth in like, I think that's a later chapter. So you will be able to see that later. But yes, it is productively efficient. So yeah, go ahead. Sorry, who was that?
Oh no, you already answered my question. Thank you.
Okay, amazing. Yeah, in the future, yeah, anyone has a question, just please go for it. The chat, I can go look at it like from time to time, but I won't look at it like automatically. So yeah, ABC, productively efficient. It's what maximizes within the PPB. D is possible, but obviously like it's not optimal. E and F, not possible. You don't have enough within the economy to get to this. So here, another way you can look at opportunity cost is basically from moving from A to B in the economy, you'd be losing this delta Y of investment goods, but you'd be gaining delta X of consumption goods. So that's a way of looking at opportunity cost as well, because A and B are different like places on the economy, which might be like efficient for an economy, but they're both as efficient, but obviously you're getting a different amount of consumption goods and investment goods of both. But this is just another way of seeing opportunity cost. So this would be delta Y would be the opportunity cost of getting more X, basically. So that's for opportunity cost. One other thing, I think a key idea in chapter 1 and 2, chapters 1 and 2 don't have that much, I think, like economics wise. So one big thing again is the economic systems. I don't know how much you'll be asked about this, but basically there's traditional economies. There, you do not have much of them anymore. Their behavior is mostly based on tradition. Then you have command economies. So these are where economic decisions are basically made by a central planning authority. If you guys have to remember anything, USSR is a like really clear example of this, because the Soviet like central planning authority would choose what would be produced in the economy and by who. Then we have free market economies. These economic decisions are made by private households and firms. So it's basically the market. So supply and demand, supply of firms and demand of households dictates how and what is going to be produced. And then you have mixed economies where it's basically the free market, but you also have government intervention. So that's basically the government can come in and provide some stuff. For example, a lot of economies right now are mixed economies. So here's just like a small practice question just on chapters 1 and 2. I'm sorry, I left a lot of stuff highlighted. It's just like the things. I'll try to make sure that whatever I post online is not highlighted. Basically here, this is an opportunity cost question. I put the answers just so that people can see them later. Here, if it takes you 1 hour to make a window and 3 hours to make a door, what is the opportunity cost of making a window? This is quite a straightforward example. Here, if you look at it, it only takes you an hour to make a window. So if you're making a window, it takes you an hour, and it takes you 3 hours to make a door. So in that 1 hour, you'd only be able to make a third of the door, if that makes sense to anyone. Other way around, the opportunity cost of making a door, you know that it takes you 3 hours to make this door, and it only takes you an hour to make a window. So in those 3 hours, you can make 3 windows, basically. So that's the whole idea of opportunity cost. That's a clear example just to illustrate it. On to chapter 3, key ideas again. I'm just going through quickly. Like if you guys have any questions later for chapters, you guys can ask me later. Here, the main concepts in chapter 3 are demand and supply. So a main thing I really wanted to emphasize in this review session is the key distinction between demand and quantity demanded. I feel like some people struggle with this. It's basically quantity demanded. I always think just x-axis in any graph. It is always going to be the x-axis. I think I have, yeah, here. So here you have quantity per period. That is quantity demanded. Whereas the actual demand, the demand curve in a graph is actually the relationship between the price and the quantity demanded. So they're not the same. When you say demand increases, it obviously often means quantity demanded, but then when you say quantity demanded has changed, it doesn't necessarily mean demand in itself has changed. So basically here, the quantity demanded is going to be the total amount of a good or service that consumers want to purchase during some time period. And then here between a demand curve will show that as the price increases, the quantity demanded lowers. So here, as the price is higher at Y, this is the quantity demanded, but then much lower price here, U, quantity demanded is much, much bigger. So yeah, okay, big difference as well here is the difference between the movements along the demand curve versus the shift of demand curve. I think that might be a big one for people. When you look here, a movement along the curve is really only caused by a change in the price of the good we're looking at. So here it would be apples. So if the price of apples changes for some strange reason, let's say there's a shortage of apples because, I mean, most of them, something happened to them, a disease, then obviously the price will maybe increase because of that. So here, if we go from 100 to 60, we're going to move from Y to W, but that does not mean there's a demand shift because people don't want more apples necessarily. Oops, my bad. So then the demand shift, here, the main determinants of the demand shift are consumer income, price of other goods, tastes, population, expectations of the future. So I'll just illustrate one example, consumer income. If your income increases, you might have more income to spend on an apple per week. So that would mean that at every single price, so let's say like along this like line here, from you're starting here, at every single price here, you're willing to consume more of these. And so that's really the difference between demand shift and the movement. It shows that like a demand shift is every single price, there's more demand for them. Whereas here, it's only at different prices that the quantity demanded changes. So that's the really big distinction. I hope that's clear. If anyone has any questions, just interrupt me. Here, so a practice, again, I put the answers, that's just for the sake of like later when this is recorded, people get the answer straight away. So basically here, the main difference is that in the first question, it asks you, people now have a bigger preference for Coca-Cola, for example. So is this a shift or a movement? Here, the price of Coca-Cola has not changed in any sense. It's like an exogenous thing, something outside of this like little graph that has changed, and it's the preference for Coca-Cola. So this would represent a shift of demand out. So in our previous thing, it would be a D0 to D1. The next one is if the price of Pepsi decreases, does this represent a shift in demand or a movement along the demand curve for Pepsi? Here, because it's actually talking about the price of the good we're looking at, it would definitely be a movement along the curve. Since nothing outside has changed, it's in the graph that you can see the price has changed. Okay, now onto supply. This is extremely similar to demand. Again, the difference between quantity supplied and the actual supply. Quantity supplied is on the x-axis on any graph, as you can see here. And then supply curve, again, just shows the relationship between price and quantity supplied. So here, they're upward sloping, not downward sloping like a demand curve. So here, as the price increases, firms are more and more willing to supply at these higher costs, because essentially they're going to get higher costs for them, a higher price for them. So it might cover their costs more. So more and more suppliers are willing and able to supply at these higher prices. So again, difference between movement along the supply curve and the movement a shift. The movement along is really because at these higher prices, there are more suppliers. So there's going to be more supplied. Whereas here, the shift is really at every single price, more is supplied. And those will be, again, exogenous to price. They'll be different to price, the reasons. So that would be the price of inputs. For example, if you have to make an apple, let's say water is an input to making apples. If the price of water decreases, it means you can make apples more easily, and then more people are willing and able to supply every single price. So that's basically the main idea. So again, I put two examples of shifts actually. So here, if new technology is created that speeds up the production of cotton, it could be any good here. This helps inputs and makes inputs cheaper. So then you have a shift outwards. More and more people are willing to supply and able to supply every single price. Again, if a tax is imposed, this is an opposite effect. If you put a tax, basically it makes it more expensive for every producer to produce. So this basically means that at every price, producers are less willing and able to supply. So that would represent a supply shift. Oops, sorry, wrong way. This way, opposite way to what's in the graph here. Again, sorry if I'm going a bit fast, but we only have 2 hours. So here, then your next thing, when you have both demand and supply curves, the next thing is putting these together in a graph to find market equilibrium. So essentially this just puts firms' household demand with firms' supply, such that you can find the price here, equilibrium, the price and quantity at which the market is going to supply. Here it's apples. So here supply and demand intersect at, I don't know, 765 and 60. So here in the equilibrium, $60 will be asked, let's say, for apples, and then 65 will be produced. So essentially, here's a practice question. I feel like this might be likely what you guys will be asked. I'm not exactly sure what the format of your exam is, but if you're given two supply, like a supply and a demand function, essentially in equilibrium, you know that these have to be equal as like right here. So you would equate QD and QS. So here you're given 120 minus 4p and 20 plus 2p. So you equate these, so QD equals QS. Here I've done it quickly. This gives you 6p equals 100. P is 100 divided by 6. This gives you p star. So here, obviously these are not the same example, but here it would be equal to 16.67 and q star is equal to 53.3. So yeah, if anyone has questions, go ahead, but I think that's quite clear, I hope. So that's basically what you would have to do if you are asked the equilibrium price and quantity. Chapter 4, key ideas. Okay, so this is all about price elasticity of demand, of supply, I think income elasticity, and cross price elasticity. So basically, all of these have something to do with the responsiveness of quantity demanded or supplied to a change in price. So basically, if you look at this, if we were to have a supply shift, let's say to the left, it's obviously going to change quantity and price. So basically, it's basically looking at if you change the price, what is going to be the effect on quantity or supply. So I put the formulas here. I'm not going to go through the formulas just because it's an open book exam. So normally you guys should have the notes on this from class and they're literally right here. But essentially PED, so I wrote PED and PES, that's how I was learned, but you can see them as like a little weird E. They're written different ways. But basically, once you find this, if your result is less than 1, your result is basically inelastic. So that means that if there's a change in price, your supply or demand, depending on which one you're looking at, does not respond very strongly to this change in price. So essentially, if there's a 1% change in price, your quantity supplied or demanded only changes by less than 1%. So basically inelastic. However, if it's greater than 1, this basically means that if you change price by 1%, your quantity demanded or supplied changes by more than 1%. So that basically means that if you're changing the price of this good, you're going to find a big difference in the quantity demanded and supplied afterwards. And then there's unit elasticity. This is basically the change is proportional. So you change price by 1%, the change in quantity or demanded or supplied is going to be 1% as well. So those are just the different ones. I think I put a few graphs here. I won't go through this much. It's important to remember as well, along a demand curve, the elasticity is not the same. So here in the middle, it's unitary, so proportional. But then here it's inelastic, so does not respond much to a price change. Whereas here it's much more elastic and changes much more with a price change. And actually at the axes, it's the extremes. So here it's completely, it's infinity, and here it's 0. But I don't know if you guys need to know that. Sorry, someone got a question?
Yes, are those numbers relative to 1 instead of -1, or am I mistaken?
Oh, sorry. Okay, basically, yeah, this is basically a thing. I know I looked through your textbook, and basically if you look back at the, wait, I'm gonna go back to the slide before. Essentially here, demanded, quantity demanded is actually going to, if you look at a graph here, basically if price increases, can everyone see my mouse when I move it? Yes, I hope so. Basically, if you are going to change price, quantity supplied is going to move upwards, right? And you're going to get more quantity supplied. But when you move that way, you're going to get less quantity demanded. So basically, when you look at this formula, this on the numerator is going to be negative normally, but in your textbook, and most textbooks look at this, they actually just put the absolute change. So they don't actually put the negative, they just put the change in absolute terms. They don't put the negative of it. So that means that you get normally when you actually look at price elasticity of demand, it's meant to be negative, but most people just put it in absolute terms and then it's positive. So yes, on this one graph I looked here, it is just see it as being all smaller or greater than, yeah, actually all the signs should be the other way around then. But here elastic range is going to be greater than 1 towards infinity, and this one is going to be smaller than 1 towards 0. Sorry, that really is not a very clear graph. I'm sorry for that one. I will try to change it. So then the other ones, does that clear it? I hope that was clear.
That's for me, thanks.
Okay, cool. But yeah, no, that's really not clear. In the textbook, I hope your profs mentioned that, basically just absolute terms. So when you look at the formulas, just don't put the negative and then everything will be in positive as you probably learned it in class. So yeah, these are just like the extremes, and here the two we're really concerned about, the inelastic and elastic. Basically here it's relatively flat. So basically a small change in price is going to lead to a big change in quantity, and this one the other way around. Small change in price a change in price is a very small change in quantity. So that's the most important. And then this is a supply. Obviously the demand curve is, the supply curve is upward sloping, not downward sloping. So it's just the same, relatively straight line for inelastic, relatively flat again for elastic, but basically the same thing, just the other way around. Oh yes, so for these, what can determine elasticity and how extreme they are is, for demand, it's the availability of substitutes. If you think about it, When you look at Coca-Cola and Pepsi, those are extremely close substitutes. So if the price of Coca-Cola was to rise, I think many people would change to Pepsi. So that basically means that the elasticity of demand for Coca-Cola is quite high. So, but then if a good doesn't have many substitutes, obviously that will mean that the elasticity is much, much more inelastic. And then again, long run versus short run, this basically tends, the main example for this is, imagine the price of petrol were to increase. In the short run, most people are going to continue buying petrol because they need to use their car for it. In the long run, let's say years or something, if the price of petrol is still as high, people may have had the time to change towards an electric car. So that means the effectiveness of the price will have changed because people will be more likely to substitute towards other goods. So that's basically the idea between the long run and short run. So PED, for example, is going to be quite inelastic in the short run, but much more elastic in the long run. Same thing for supply, actually. If firms are able to substitute towards other goods and produce those other goods instead of the good that's like more costly to them now, they will. And so that determines the PES. And then long run versus short run, again, same thing. In the short run, a firm might not be able to change their production towards another good. In the long run, they might be able to. So that will determine the elasticity of supply. Oh yeah, so another really important thing is elasticity affects taxes, and that is a thing that governments look into a lot when they want to implement a tax, especially on goods like, let's say, cigarettes that are very inelastic. People have, it's addictive, so people will not change their habits as easily. So it's something governments look into a lot when they determine taxes. So basically, the elasticity determines the incidence of a tax. So when the demand is inelastic relative to supply, so when demand is much more vertical and supply is much more flat, consumers bear most of the burden of a tax. And the other way around, if supply is inelastic, so much more straight line compared to demand, producers bear most of the burden. So I'll show that in a diagram like right now. Here, essentially, you have demand that is much more inelastic. So as you can see, the tax basically is this whole difference between the two supply curves, right? So it'd be from this point, E1, to down here on the red line. So that would be the whole tax. That's what government would be getting from the firms and the consumers on the good. So here, because demand is very inelastic, consumers bear most of the burden. So consumer burden would actually be from, where's my math? There we go, here to this point here where the intersect of like the two dotted lines go to P0. So it's basically P0 to PC to here. And producer burden is much, much smaller. It's from P0 to PS. And then you just go down here. It's this very, very small rectangle. I hope that was clear. If someone can't see that, just tell me, I'll start again. And then opposite here, the tax again is the same, the distance between the two supply curves. But here, supply is much more inelastic. That way, consumer burden is much smaller here, this little rectangle, whereas producer burden is much, much bigger. It's huge here. So yeah, that's basically the difference. So obviously, depending on who you want the burden to stay on the most, you will, you can't change the elasticity, but knowing the elasticity really helps policymakers choose if they are going to put it in how big. So the next one is income elasticity of demand. Again, I'm not going to go over the formula just because you guys have it. But few main things to remember is that normal goods have a positive income elasticity. So as your income increases, you're able to spend more on these goods. Let's say chocolate, that's a normal good. An inferior good has a negative income elasticity. This is because inferior goods are basically, let's think, if you don't buy branded goods, you buy, let's say, your like generic supermarket brand. As your income increases, you're most likely to switch from those generic brands to more branded goods, if that makes sense. So that's basically what the idea behind inferior goods is. And then luxuries and necessities. It's the idea that obviously if something's a necessity, let's say like a staple food like rice, it's not because you become richer that you're necessarily going to increase your demand for it, and you're going to demand it as much as if you're poor. So that's the difference between those goods. Then you have cross elasticity of demand. This is basically looking at if you increase the price of one good, what is the effect on the demand of another good, which is super interesting to look at for substitutes, let's say Coca-Cola and Pepsi. If they're very close substitutes, there's a positive cross elasticity, because essentially if you increase the price of Coca-Cola, the quantity demanded is going to be big, let's say, and will be positive for Pepsi. Complements, on the other hand, basically those refer to, let's say, a DVD and a DVD player. You obviously need one for the other. So if the price increases of one of them, your quantity demanded of the other one is going to decrease. So they're negatively related. So I hope that's clear. That's basically for elasticity. Oh yes, as well. I mean, your exam is open book, but if you happen to just blank and can't find the formulas, always remember on every single formula, it's always quantity demanded or supplied as the numerator on top. And it's always price or income or something like that on the bottom, but it's always quantity on the top. Oh, so yeah, a practice question. What sucks with this all being online, I obviously cannot draw graphs as easily, but this would, I don't know if I did not. This, you can draw this out if you want, but you don't need to for this question. So essentially here it's looking at a price increase from 2 to 3 and a quantity demanded that changes from 4,500 minus 1,500 to 3,000 essentially, and quantity supplied changing from 4,500 to 5,000. So how would you go about this? Basically, you would calculate the percentage change in quantity, and here you're going from 4,500 to 3,000. So that's decreasing by 33.3%. And the price, you're essentially increasing from 2 to 3. So that's a 50% increase. And that gives you an elasticity of 0.67, which is inelastic since it is less than 1. PES, same thing. You look at the change in quantity, which is 11.1. Look at the change in price, which is the exact same one as before, 50. And this gives you 0.22. So that is even more inelastic, but still an elastic supply. So you basically, oh, I need to change that. It's not a relatively flat demand curve. So sorry. It's a relatively steep vertical demand curve. But the supply curve is going to be steeper because the number is even lower and closer to 0. Yeah, sorry, that's a typo on my part. Again, here is a question more relating to excise tax. You might get that in the exam. So here, basically, government imposes a tax of $1 per bottle. Before the tax, you're given the equilibrium quantity of 2,000 and the price of 1. And then after the tax, the market equilibrium shifts to 1.8. So I just want to make sure everyone realizes that although there's a tax of $1, the equilibrium quantity and price, like the price doesn't change from 1 to 2, it changes from 1 to 1.8. And I did a diagram. It is absolutely horrendous. I am so sorry. But basically here you can see the price starts at 1. And essentially because the supply and demand curves are not vertical or horizontal, you don't have a perfect increase like this. You have a contraction basically along the demand curve and a shift, which leads to 1.8. So that is basically why the number is 1.8 and not 2 for anyone who might be confused to why that would be. So when you go back, basically to look at the burden of the tax on the consumer, we can go back on my diagram. This would be from the original price, so 1, up to 1.8. And it would be this rectangle here, which you calculate by doing 1.8 minus 1, which is the new price, the old price and the new price, which is 0.8. So basically the consumer bears 0.8 out of $1, which is essentially 80% of the tax, which I did not represent very well, but it is most of the tax. And then overall burden, if you have to, you can just look at that, and that's essentially how much the consumer is bearing, 0.8, which we calculate right here, times the new quantity, which we get of 1,400. And that's basically, you can look at it here, it goes from 2,000 to 1,400, and that is basically this area. You do 0.8 times 1,400. So it gives you this. And then on the producer, it's basically what's left. You know that the whole tax is $1, and you know that their new original supplying price was 0.8. So you just do 1 minus 0.8, 0.2, and then 0.2 of 1 is 20% of the tax. So they're obviously bearing much less of the tax. I always find it very useful to draw these graphs just because it always helps you visualize, always avoids the problem of assuming that the new equilibrium is $1 over. But yes, hope that was clear as well. Not a great picture, but yes. So yeah, now I'm gonna go on to chapter 5, key ideas. I'm also probably gonna give you guys a 5-minute break if you guys want it in like half an hour. So yeah, I'll ask in half an hour and see if people do want a break. So chapter 5 is mostly after now we've done the equilibrium price elasticities, it's now looking at price floors and ceilings. So essentially this is often to correct or address a problem the government sees. So let's say here a price floor is always set above the equilibrium price because essentially the price floor is a price that means that you suppliers can sell it higher, but essentially they're not going to sell it. They're going to sell it P1, but it means that they cannot go to P0 as they would normally sell it at. So it's just it's a minimum price basically at which a product can be sold. And this could be done for wages, for example. It's often done for wages so that people can actually have a decent living. It could also, it could be done for other things, but the main one is the minimum wage, just so that people actually have a decent living. And so basically when the government does this, it leads to an excess of supply, because at this price, basically demand is here because people don't want to buy this good at the higher price, not as many. So these many people do not want to buy this good anymore at this price. So quantity demand is Q1. However, at this higher price, there are many more suppliers that can or are now able to supply. So essentially they would be willing to supply all this, so Q2. So it basically means that you have this excess supply here, which governments may be able to solve by buying this up. They could store it if it's a good that can be stored. But yeah, basically you get an excess supply here. This is the main problem. So yeah, you look at it between the two places where P1 intersects the supply and demand. Then you have a price ceiling that is not the opposite, but essentially it's a maximum price now. And to be efficient, this has to be put below the equilibrium price, because essentially it's a maximum price at which a product can be sold. So this is often done for rent. For example, if you want rent to be affordable to people, you could also have it if a government really wants, for example, let's say milk to be affordable to their population, they could put a price ceiling on milk. That way milk is now sold at P1 and not P0 so that everyone can afford it. So basically this leads to an excess demand, very similarly to the other one. It's basically here at this much lower price, suppliers, this many suppliers basically, are not willing and able to supply at this lower price. So they're willing to supply Q2. But at this price, there is many more people that can now afford this good. So it's from basically from E to here, there's more people that can afford it, and they will be demanding Q1. Essentially, this leads to an excess of demand. Oh, sorry, is there a question?
Yeah, if you don't mind. Does the success of a black market depend on how low the price ceiling is set?
Honestly, I'm not entirely sure, but I would think so, because I will talk about the black market in 2 seconds. But basically, essentially, the black market develops because at this price, suppliers can only supply in the formal market at P1, since the government imposed this. But they obviously know that at this price, at this quantity, there's all these people that are actually willing to pay above this price. So demand shows all the people. Basically, on a demand curve, you have this little person that is willing to pay this price. You have this little person that's willing to pay this price. It goes all the way to here, and then these people can only afford this price, basically. So at this quantity, because there's such an excess of demand, they do know that they have these people, all these people above here, that are actually willing to pay much more than this P1. So on the black market, they could sell it at this price. So yeah, I'm assuming that obviously if the price is lower, let's say here, so if you have a horizontal line here, you would have an even bigger excess of demand. So even more people might be willing to spend. But I also wonder if your profits might not be smaller because actually, I'm not sure. I really do think the black market is probably more likely to develop if the price is even lower, because more and more suppliers would find an alternative to selling at this very, very low price. So yeah, okay, I would think it's more likely, but I'm not entirely sure, and I don't think it's in your textbook, so don't want to say anything that's wrong.
Okay, thanks.
But yeah, good question. But yeah, definitely, so here what I was saying, there's basically an excess of demand. So basically at this price, there are many suppliers that obviously would be willing to supply much more of their product. So this is how a black market can develop, because people would be willing to pay up to this P2 price. So basically on the black market, people could sell their good at P2 and not P1. And so they'd be getting all this excess profit. So it's essentially the quantity they'd be selling times this price difference. So that's the more profits they'd be getting, because they'd be getting this profit already, well, minus their cost. So yeah, that's basically on the price ceiling. Oh, sorry, there we go. So sorry, here's a practice question. Already this first, is this a price ceiling or floor? This is a ceiling. When the price is set below the equilibrium price, you usually know it's a ceiling, because otherwise it wouldn't really be efficient. So the price ceiling is that it doesn't go above this ceiling. If it was a floor, there's just really no point of putting it there. A floor is just like a minimum. So yeah, this one's a maximum price. You cannot go above it. They do not want it to actually reach this price of 3 here. They only want it to go to 2 and not above. So here, calculate the change in surplus for producers and consumers. I don't know how many of you are very good. Like, okay, so I did some awful graphs again there. I will look at those in 2 seconds. Basically, consumer surplus is any area below a demand curve and above a price. So before the this price ceiling, you have a consumer surplus that is above 3 and below this demand curve. So I drew it here. This is consumer surplus before. And then producer surplus is anything above a supply curve and below the equilibrium price. So before you start, you just have these 2 nice little triangles that make up this whole triangle here. So that's before. And then after, since now you have this price, consumers are obviously much happier because many more of them can afford this good. So you have a much bigger triangle. I'm just going to show it here. So essentially consumers, if they could get this quantity of 40, would have a huge consumer surplus. But since they cannot, they are actually restricted this quantity because suppliers are only willing to supply 20. So essentially they're not getting this huge triangle like they would get if they were getting 40, but they are still getting a bigger chunk. So they're getting this weird trapezium shape, which I drew here. So they would be getting this triangle and this triangle on top of it if they were getting 40, but since they're only getting 20, they're getting this weird trapezium shape. And then producer surplus are really the ones that lose out from this because essentially they before were producing at price 3 and getting this for their good, but now they're only getting price 2. So price 2 means that now their equilibrium price is here, and above the supply curve means they're getting this much smaller triangle. And then this, as we're going to see, is basically a deadweight loss. It's this fact that before this was consumer surplus, this little triangle, this was producer surplus, and now that is just gone. No one is getting this surplus anymore. So that's basically the main problem with these kind of price ceilings and floors. They're good because more of the population can get access to it, but they will cause a deadweight loss, which is why some countries like do not put it, but then sometimes it's essential, especially for minimum wages, for example. So yeah, how you would calculate the change in surplus, basically you would look at the producer surplus before. So before it is 2 times 20 divided by 2, because this is basically 2. And then this is 20, I don't know why it starts at 10. So it's 30 minus 10, so 20. So this triangle here would be 2 times 20 divided by 2. And then that's 20. And then afterwards, you would take the very small triangle here, which I showed before, is just 1 and 1 times 10 divided by 2, 5. So you look at the change, and the change is essentially a negative change because they've obviously gotten a big one before, and now they get a smaller triangle. So it's going to be a negative 15. So 5 minus 20. Consumer surplus, again, you look at it, you know, it's this triangle before, which is 20. And then after, it's a weird trapezium. So basically what I did is I just took this rectangle and then the triangle, and that's how you find 25. And then here it's a positive change because they actually gain a bit. So it's 25 minus 20, and that's 5. And if you are to add these up, you would find the area with the deadweight loss, sorry. If you add the deadweight loss, you'll find the same area normally because it's obviously the same starting off big triangle area. So if you add this area, and this area, it will get you to these 2 areas combined. So that's how you can check your answers, by the way, during exams, for example. You can always just check the areas add up. That was one practice question. Chapter 6, key ideas. Now this.
Sorry, I just have a question.
Yeah, of course, go for it. Is it on this? Do you need these?
Yes.
Okay, go.
So is price ceiling can also like cause the black market?
So yes, here, as we saw, the price ceiling is the one that's going to cause the black market because it's the one that really reduces prices. So firms are often quite hurt by this. So firms, obviously, they'd be at the equilibrium, they'd be producing at price P0 and Q0. But since the price has decreased, they are obviously much less able. For example, this P1 might not cover the cost of some firms. So less of them are able to supply at this price. So that's why if they're able to, they will try sell on the black market at much higher costs, which will cover their costs more easily and also just generate more profits. So yeah, it's with a price ceiling because with a price floor, suppliers actually they're quite happy. It's for households that are hurt more because they do not like this higher price. So yes, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean like for price floor, is there also a black market for suppliers?
For supply, no, because basically here demand is lower. So actually, if there were to be a black market, there is no demand for it, basically, because here it's in the case of a price floor, you have excess supply. So it's actually suppliers that are willing and able to supply more, but there's no demand for it. So even if they were to sell on a black market at a price higher than P1, there'd be no demand for it. The price is already high enough for people, for households, so there would be no demand for it. So it's only in the case of a price ceiling that you will see a black market, because there actually is this whole excess demand that is actually willing to pay much higher than the P1 price. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, cool, perfect. Okay, chapter 6. So this is all the key ideas are basically marginal utility and consumer choice. So looking at marginal utility, this is basically the utility you get from consuming one additional unit of a good. So basically, as you're consuming, let's say 1 bar of chocolate, your utility, will be quite high. And then as you eat the second bar of chocolate, it'll be still quite high. Again, the next one, and there's a point where you will not want more chocolate. You've had enough chocolate. And that is basically where your marginal utility is either 0 or it's decreasing, actually. So you get negative utility. You do not, like, you're not happy with this extra bar of chocolate, essentially. And so this is how you see the marginal utility. It's high, it's like positive, but decreasing, basically. And then it goes negative, and that's when you really don't want more chocolate. And then the total utility here, you can see it's increasing. But for all of you that can see the slope is quite steady, and then the slope is decreasing. So it just shows that you are getting extra utility, but just not as much as before, until it flattens out. So this is where your utility is the same, and then there it's going to start decreasing. So that's when, basically, this is optimal. This point is when your total utility is maximized, and that's where marginal utility is equal to 0. So yeah, this is all about the law of diminishing marginal utility. Basically, you'll be very happy getting extra and extra goods until you're not anymore, because it's not giving you extra benefit by consuming more.
Juliet?
Yes, go for it.
Does diminishing marginal utility only come in when the value of the next unit is less than the value of the current unit?
Yeah, so the marginal utility is the additional utility you get. So basically, is it comparing? It's the sense that, like, when the first unit, you're going to get a utility of, like, let's say 4. Then the next utility, looking at it alone, the extra utility you get is 3. So yeah, actually it is adding up. So if you were to, like, add those all up, the first utility you get 3, the next one you get 4, then 3, that's a total utility of 7. So if you, like, accumulate that up, yes, it's when your total utility reaches a point where it starts decreasing again. So it is that every time the diminishing is showing that each unit extra you consume, you're getting less and less of it. So as I said, you consume the first unit, you get utility 4. You consume the next unit, you get utility 3. So it's still positive, you're still getting utility from it, but it's decreasing every time until you get to a point where your marginal utility is 0. So there's a point where let's say, like, for my case, if it's decreasing by 1 every time, it's going to get to a point where my 4th good is basically getting me 0 utility, and that's when I should stop. That's my optimal, basically. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks very much.
Okay, cool, perfect. So yeah, that's all about the diminishing marginal utility. It's basically decreasing. And it's here, the slope is increasing until it decreases. So this is optimal. Okay, so utility maximization. Here is the whole idea that when subject to prices, consumers obviously have to make a choice. They have to maximize their utility. This is the whole idea that agents want to, like, as rational beings, we want to be as happy as we can be. So we maximize our utility. And so a utility maximizing consumer allocates expenditures so that the marginal utility obtained from the last dollar spent on each product is equal. So it's the sense that you want to allocate your budget across your goods such that you're getting as much utility from each one. You don't want to get a huge amount of utility from one of them and, like, 0 from another. Ideally, you want to get as much utility as you can from each good. So this is the whole formula here. You want the marginal utility of X, like the ratio of marginal utility of X to Y, to be the same as the price of X to Y. So that's basically the idea behind this. This is just a formula. Just honestly, just have that key in your notes, and that will help you answer any questions. So here, consumer's demand curve. As price changes, the utility maximizing condition must still hold. So basically, if you look at a demand curve, if the price of X increases, less of the good is consumed, such that the marginal utility increases. And that's how this equality is always restored. Because if the price of X were to increase without your demand, like the quantity demanded changing, you would get the same utility and this whole equation wouldn't hold. So the whole thing holds because as the price of X increases, you consume less, so your marginal utility rises, since we saw that marginal utility decreases as you consume more. So that's how this equality stays. So that's how a rise in the price of a product leads each consumer to reduce the quantity demanded. As we saw on the whole demand curve, as the rise in product occurs, you consume less of it. So that's basically just relating demand curves to utility, because basically along a demand curve, you have, a demand curve is basically marginal utility. You might often see a demand curve being labeled NB, which is marginal benefit. So basically a demand curve just looks at the marginal benefit you get from consuming goods, essentially. So that's just connecting the two. So yeah, when you change the quantity of product that you demand, it changes its price. So basically when an increase in price occurs, you change your quantity demanded, and that's due to two effects, income and substitution effects. So the substitution effect basically looks at the fact that when the price of a good, let's say Coca-Cola, increases, and that the price of chocolate hasn't changed at all, the relative price of Coca-Cola to chocolate has changed, it's increased. So that means that you might substitute some of your income towards a bit more of another good just because it's now cheaper relative to Coca-Cola that has increased in price. So first you'll change your quantity demanded based on substitution, but you might also change it based on income, because essentially if you're buying a good that's a normal good, as your income decreases, as the price of that good increases, with the same income, you can't afford as much of it, basically. So if you're buying 5 bars of chocolate with your income per week, if the bars of chocolate become a bit more expensive the next week, you might only be able to afford 4. So that's the income effect, basically. So you have the substitution effect because now your Coca-Cola, or let's just keep the example of chocolate, the price of chocolate has increased. So substitution is that basically chocolate is now more expensive compared to apples. So you might substitute towards other products because chocolate is more expensive. The income effect is the pure effect that basically you can't afford as much with the same income, basically, if the price of chocolate increases. So I hope that's clear. That's basically the two effects that occur when you change the quantity demanded. And obviously the other way can happen. If the price of decreases, you'll be able to afford more of them, and that good will be relatively less expensive compared to other goods. So just either way, but it's basically those two effects. So that's how, combining both the income and substitution effects, the demand for any normal good will be negatively sloped, because basically, as I said, the substitution effect, price of chocolate increases, other goods are relatively cheaper. And then the income effect, because for a normal good, if your income changes, you will buy more of that good. The other way around, if your income stays the same, but that price changes, it will affect your demand for it. So that's basically just important. That's basically just explaining how the slope of the demand curve is negatively sloped. So yeah, there's just one important example. The given goods are products with a positively sloped demand curve. So as the price rises, quantity demand does not fall. So I doubt you guys have done much on it, but that's just an exception. That's just something to remember. A given good is an exception. It's a positively positively curved demand curve, which you do not often see. I think I'll finish this chapter, and if you guys want to break, you guys can just put in the chat and just say yes, and then I will give you guys a break. But yeah, just finishing this off, consumer surplus, you guys have actually already seen it because I put a practice example of it. I think people just put in the chat. Yes, okay, amazing. So yeah, basically I just put it before, but consumer surplus is below the demand curve, above the equilibrium price. So it's basically this triangle, much better drawn than I did before. So that's just consumer surplus. So here is just in a practice question I put concerning the marginal utility maximizing thing I put before. Basically, you want the ratio of your prices to be equal to the ratio of the marginal utilities. So here in this example, you're given the price of X is 7 and the price of Y is 5. So you know that that ratio is 7/5. So importantly, if you have to find the utility maximizing quantity. For me, I just know 7/5 is obviously PX is greater than PY. So you need MUX to be greater than MUY. So you just look between, oh, actually, never mind. Oh, no, actually, some of them are more, yeah, the other way around. So this only starts here. So 3, 4, 5 could be correct questions. And then you can either trial and error. I can tell that 32/30 is not 7/5, and you can just see that 20, you just trial and error, 28/20 is 7/5. So that would be your answer. That's just a very simple practice question. Again, here is another quite straightforward one. Here, basically, if you're given a graph in your multiple choice questions or whatever, a supply shift, basically, if you are asked the area before a shift, it would be this area here that I drew here. Because essentially before the shift, the price is P. So you look above P and below D, and that's this triangle. After the shift, the price is now moved to P1. So it's lower. So now you have this triangle above P1, below demand curve, and that is your new triangle. So that's basically very straightforward. And then, yeah, I'm on chapter 7. So I will honestly just give you guys a break if you guys want it. I see a lot of, yeah, I think everyone wants a break. So I will just give you, like, guys, like, let's say 5 minutes. So actually 4, if that's fine with you guys. We'll start again at Canadian time, 7 p.m. I think that's right. You guys can just answer yes or in the chat, whatever. I will just be waiting here.
Are we starting back at 7?
Yeah, if that's, I mean, actually a bit later, we can do 7. We'll just do 5 minutes. That's perfect. Okay, is everyone ready to go back? You guys can chat, I'll start in 10 seconds. Okay, amazing. So yeah, as I said in the chat and before, this will be posted online hopefully as soon as possible. And yeah, for anyone, just interrupt me whenever if you guys have a question, and I will also be available for some questions afterwards. Hopefully this doesn't take more than 2 hours. I really don't want to take too much of your time. So we'll see, because I know the later chapters are a bit more difficult, but it should be fine. So chapter 7, okay, this is where we start with production costs and profits. Basically, so you have a production function in econ, function of labor and capital, basically, which is what most economics models look at. So it's the relationship between inputs and outputs. So with labor and capital, what can you produce, basically? One of the main distinctions in this chapter is the difference between economic versus accounting profits. So accounting profits are usually just revenues minus costs. So that's just looking at what revenue you're getting and what it costs you to make. Whereas economic profits actually take into account revenues and costs, same thing, but they make the distinction between explicit and implicit, and they look at both, because explicit costs basically just look at the cost of what costs it takes you to do it, like what costs can you see. The implicit ones are the ones that you don't usually see. It's the opportunity costs, as I was talking about in chapter 1 too. It's basically also takes into account the opportunity cost of the other next best alternative. So you made a choice of using a certain production factory or a certain method of production. What was the alternative? So it looks into those. So that's basically the main difference if you guys are asked about that. And then, so in production, in economics, you often have the short run, the long run, and the very long run. So the difference between the three are the short run, some factors are fixed. Most economic models, that's often capital. Basically, the idea is that you can often hire a person much more easily, quickly, than it is like how easy it is to make a different factory piece, for example, that you need, or to even build a new factory, which is hard, like a lot of capital. In the long run, all factors are variable, but existing technology cannot be changed. So essentially here now you can change labor and capital easily. If you wanted to increase production, you can do that not only with labor, but also by increasing capital. Let's say have a second factory. However, in the long run, the technology cannot be changed. And that is only in the very long run, technological possibilities can change. So you can have innovation, which could mean that costs can change for firms. That's only in the very long run. So basically that's the distinction. So when we're looking at short run production, there are many curves. You guys will see them. I think I put them a bit further. All these curves, lovely curves. So basically the whole idea behind these is that you have total and average product. So the total product in production is literally your total product, how much you're making. The average product is this total product divided by the number of units of the variable factor, because we're looking at the short run, so we're only looking at labor. So the average product is this total product divided by how much labor you use to make it, since capital is fixed. The marginal product is, as I was talking about marginal utility, it's always about the change in the total output that results from using one more unit. So how much did output change when you increased labor by 1 unit, essentially. I always put variable factor, but it's always labor in the short run. Then you have there's still this law of diminishing marginal product. So basically this rule is that in the short run, since labor is fixed, the idea behind diminishing marginal product, I'm going to show you guys the curve because it'll be a bit simpler. So we're looking at this curve. So you have diminishing marginal product. Essentially it increases, plateaus, and then goes down. And the idea behind this is that basically, if you think about it in the short run, imagine you have a factory where the people's job is to staple paper. Pretty ridiculous, sorry, very bad example. But basically, if you have 10 people using the stapler, it might be, you have one person, using the stapler, fine. You have 2 people working and stapling paper, you can make more output if your output is stapled paper. So then you add 3 people, even more paper can be made. They're all sharing the stapler, they're using it, whatever. However, if you get closer and closer, let's say like 5 people, it's where maybe it's optimized. You're making the most product you can make. However, you add a 6th person, let's say, these people have to share this one stapler, which is your fixed capital. Sorry, like stapler is your capital. So essentially, by increasing the number of labor, there's a point where actually increasing your labor will not help your productivity. It's actually going to make it worse because people do not have access to the stapler, and there may be problems. Basically, your fixed capital is a limiting factor in your product growth. So that's the whole idea behind marginal product diminishing. because you have fixed capital. Sorry, where was I? Okay, yeah. And then here you will see, I'll show you this later, marginal product will always intersect AP at its maximum. So when you look at curves, I mean, I'll show you right now, it's always going to intersect AP at the maximum. Same thing, actually, the other way around for costs. MC increases and then it cuts the ABC at the minimum. So back to, yeah. Now we're looking at short run costs. Here, there's way more costs because you look at total costs. In the short run, you have a fixed cost and the variable costs. Basically, the fixed cost is, let's say you have a factory, it's the price of the factory. That's a fixed cost. You have this huge fixed cost that you need to pay the factory. Then your variable costs are, here in the short run, you only have labor. So your variable cost could be the cost of your labor. So wages, actually, that would be a very easy variable cost, because basically your variable costs depend on how much input you use. So basically, the more labor you use, the more your costs, the more variable costs you have. Okay, I think there's a question in the chat. Is in the beginning, it's increasing marginal product due to specialization, right? Yeah, specialization and also just increasing your input factor is just going to increase your product, essentially. It's just the fact that if you have more and more people doing this job, you're going to be able to produce more of it, and it decreases because you have a limiting factor of capital. Does that answer the question? I hope so. So yeah, so you have total costs, which are shared between the fixed cost and variable costs. Variable costs depend only on the input. So those arise because of the input. So wages, they could be, I don't know, if you have a labor union, they could be anything to do with your inputs. So then average total cost is your average fixed cost and your average variable cost, which always just divided by the input. And then marginal costs is, again, just the change in total cost that was brought about by the increase in quantity. So it's always just the change. By making more, how did it change the cost? Marginal are always variable costs because fixed costs do not change as input output varies. So that's the whole fact that variable costs change because your output only changes because you're changing the input. So the marginal costs cannot be involved with the fixed costs. The fixed costs are just there. They're always just there. So the marginal cost and the average variable cost are always to do with you increasing output because you use more input, basically. So as we saw, the MC will always intersect AC and ABC at the respective minimums. Okay, capacity is a key idea as well in this chapter. It's level of output where ATC is at its minimum. Basically, where are your costs the absolute minimum? And that's basically at the largest output that can be produced without encountering rising average cost per unit. So essentially, you'd be, yeah, this was just like a little practice thing. It's just label these and that's what they are, but I'm showing them right here. So basically capacity would be ideally where your costs are minimized. So around here, and then obviously above this, your costs are going to rise. So you do not want to be producing above that, basically. Practice here. Oh yes, okay. So if the slope of the TP curve is 3, what is the marginal productivity? So I think you guys have learned this. Basically, if you look at a total, it's not here, a total productivity curve, the slope of this is always going to be the marginal product, because the slope basically looks at how, it just looks at the change, basically, from like 1 unit, how does that change? And that's going to be a marginal product of 3. So here you're giving the slope, it's 3. When average product is at its minimum, average variable cost is where ABC, you can look at this. They're basically mirror images, if, I mean, pretty noticeable, but yeah, if you are to draw those, I would always draw them like one on top of the other. It's always super easy to see. They're basically just mirror images of themselves. As long as you always know costs rise, products decreasing. And then this is basically, I looked over them, so you guys can like look at them. If there's a problem, like just put it in the chat, whatever. But yeah, capacity that corresponds to a firm's minimum is the capacity, output is at capacity. And then you can look at this between the AVC and the ATC. They're just rising, because once between this, they're rising. You can't see this. I mean, I can't see the total cost, but if you look at other graphs, it's increasing. So yeah, here, when you look at producing in the long run, here in the long run, as I said before, all factors vary. So capital and labor can change. And in the very long run, technology can change too. So here, basically, to maximize profits, a firm is going to use this formula I gave right here, because essentially the marginal product of capital is basically how much does capital, when you increase capital, how much is it increasing your output by? And so you do not want to be paying and like buying these capital for more than their marginal product, if that makes sense. Like you will not want to be spending on capital more than the product is going to give to you in your output. It'd be pretty inefficient. And then the same thing for labor. And that's how the ratio of marginal products, capital and labor, it should be equal to the price, like the ratio price, like the price ratio of them, sorry. So that's basically, again, I would just know where this formula is in your notes, and that's just a profit maximizing formula. And this is basically the fact that there's a principle of substitution. So basically methods of production will change if the relative price of factors change, because basically you want this equation to hold. So if the price of capital increases, you're gonna substitute from capital to more labor intensive production just because labor is now relatively cheaper. So it's more worth it to counteract this increasing by increasing this essentially. So yeah, the principle of substitution is essentially that you can change your production with labor and capital and make it more profit maximizing. That's the main idea. And then we have long run cost curves. The LRIC is the lowest possible cost of producing each level of output when all inputs can be varied. So this is basically, as we saw in the long run, all inputs can be varied. So here, it's this basically. You have lots of like short run average total cost, and then you have the long run, which basically is tangent to all of these small ones. And essentially, when the LRIC is downward sloping, there are decreasing costs. So basically, as you're going down this in the long run, as you're increasing your output, the costs are getting smaller. And that's basically because of economies of scale. So essentially, let's say, as you're producing more, you as a firm, you might be able to take advantage of bulk buying, for example. That would be a huge advantage, like example of economies of scale. So as you're increasing your output, you're producing more and more of this. So you might be able to buy your inputs in bulk. And that's always, cheaper than buying them when you have less output. So the more output you have, the more inputs you'll be buying, you can buy those in bulk. So that would be an example of your costs actually getting smaller as your output increases. At the very bottom of the LRIC, you have constant returns to scale. So this is here, and that's basically your minimum efficient scale. So that's you cannot decrease your costs more. And then when it's upward sloping, this is when you get diseconomies of scale. So basically this would arise when basically your firm is way too big, you're producing way more output than is efficient, and you're actually encountering more costs. So that could be, let's say, if your firm is so big that there are now communication problems between people in your firms or whatever, or just problems in general, that would increase your costs. So that's basically the idea behind diseconomies of scale. And then this is no short run average total cost curve can fall below the long run one, because the long run one represents the lowest attainable cost for each possible output. So essentially they're always tangent, they cannot go lower. So that's the whole graph. Shifts in long run average cost curves. In the long run, firms are producing on these LRIC curves. However, in the very long run, because of technological innovation or anything, these changes can cause shifts in the LRIC. So basically, imagine there is this new innovation that comes out that makes production much, much cheaper, much easier. You'd have a shift, and you'd have a shift down. The LRIC would just come down like this, and you would just be able to produce at every single output cheaper. That's basically the whole idea behind it. So this is just a very short practice question. Here it's the whole profit maximizing formula I put before. You want MPK over MPL to be equal to PK over PL. Here it's not the case at all. So 4 is not equal to 1, so it's not profit maximizing. Basically here what could happen is that you could do more factor substitution to reduce costs further. That's the whole idea. So using the table of capital costs, you're basically told the price. So the ratio is 4/6, so 2/3. And for me, again, like here you have many methods. You have A to F. So I know that 2/3, I need MPK to be smaller than MPL. So I just looked at where this was the case. Obviously A, B, C do not fit that criteria. Only D, E, F can. And then you just either trial and error. I could just see that obviously 8 is 2 times 4, and then this 12 is 3 times 4. So you can just see that, or you can just trial and error 8/12, 6/15, 4/18, and see which one gives you 2/3. So that's basically the way you would tackle this kind of question. Chapter 9. So this is when we start looking at competitive markets and also how firms work within these markets. So I feel like this is kind of the chapters where most people struggle and really do not like them. I quite like them. So hopefully you guys will understand what I'm saying. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate, go for it. So in competitive, like in any market, firms have market power if they can influence the price of their product. Essentially, in perfect competition, they cannot influence. Basically, the assumption is that in perfect competition, there are loads and loads of tiny firms, maybe not tiny, but just loads of firms. So basically, they're all so small and have such a small market share that they cannot influence price. So in this kind of competition, there's the assumption that all of them have homogeneous products. So they're all producing the same. Let's say they all produce carrots. Then there's perfect information. Basically, that means that firms have perfect information on their competitors, so they know how to compete with them. And also households have perfect information on how to get the cheapest product. They know exactly what firms are producing at what price and basically where to go for the cheapest thing. So that's how all of them have the same price, all of them have the same good, because essentially there's no point in selling higher than your competitor because people have perfect information and will go to your competitor. There's also the assumption that there are many small firms. I said that, lots and lots of small firms that have no market share. They basically have a very, very small market share. And then in this industry, there is no barriers to enter or exit. Firms can come in, come out as easily as they please. So essentially in perfectly competitive markets, there is the normal supply and amazing. Okay. So you have a market. So there is the normal supply and demand curve in a market. However, this determines a price, P3 here. And since every single firm in this market is so small and has such a small market share, they basically face a completely elastic demand firm. So as I saw that, basically there is no point in them putting a price above 3. They will literally get no demand for it. So they basically are price takers. That's literally what they are. They take the price that is set by the market equilibrium, which I showed here to be 3. In the market equilibrium is 3. They just take that price as given and they sell their goods at 3 because there's no point in them going higher. People will buy from their competitors. So that's the idea behind perfectly competitive markets. And just in general, there is a normal downward sloping market demand curve, as I showed right before. Total revenues is P times Q. That's just normally the price times the quantity you're selling. That's going to be your total revenues. Average revenue is the total revenue divided by Q. And MR is the change in total revenue from a change in quantity. And so basically for perfectly competitive firms, since they are facing a completely flat demand curve, their MR is actually their price. And that you can see because basically if they produce 1 good, they're getting price 3. They produce 2 goods, they're getting an extra price 3. So they're just getting 2 times 3. And then here they're going to get 3 times 3. So the revenue that changes from an extra unit of output is just their price. I hope that's clear for everyone. Basically, their flat demand curves means that they're selling 1 good, they're getting price 3. They're selling a second good, they're just getting an extra 3. So it's always an extra price equivalent. So that's why in a perfectly competitive market, demand is flat and it's equal to MR. It's also equal to average revenue and to price. So all those, you can always just equate them in perfect competition because they're all the same. So as I said, extra revenue generated for competitive, as I said, they're all just equal. And now you can see because this is literally a horizontal line, and so they're just all equal, which makes it super easy to calculate often in questions. If you see a question about perfect competition, you can often just assume that the price you're given is the MR, and it just makes everything very easy. So basically, in the short run, this firm is trying to maximize profits, which is total revenue minus total cost. And basically, the short run decision for any firm is to produce or not to produce. And that's a big thing that often confuses people, is basically you have fixed costs for firms and you have variable costs. And basically, if a firm produces nothing, they're still going to have this fixed cost. So you can kind of just put that to the side, because whether they produce or they don't produce, they're going to get this fixed cost. And that might be implementing their factory. So whether they produce or not, they're going to get this fixed cost. They have to deal with this. So we might as well just put that to the side, forget about it. But then when a firm produces, if they produce, they're going to get variable costs. And those come about just because of the fact they're producing, because those come across like when you use input, and basically those, for every unit of output, you're going to get a variable cost, which is demonstrated by this curve here. So basically, if the firm decides to produce nothing, it will lose an amount equal to their fixed cost because they're not producing anything, so they have no variable cost. If the firm decides to produce, however, it will have variable cost of production and the fixed cost. So the idea behind, if you forget the fixed cost, because both of them have it, it's equal, you can just cancel them out. It will be worthwhile basically for a firm to produce if it can cover its variable costs. So I hope that makes sense, because it's often something a lot of people struggle to get a grasp of. Basically, the shutdown price of a firm is when they aren't able to make enough revenue that covers their variable costs. So basically, they need a price that is equal to the minimum of a firm's average variable costs. So that's the shutdown price, because then it won't be worth it otherwise. So they just really need revenue to exceed variable costs. So I hope that's clear. That's basically the idea of how a firm chooses to produce or not. So when you're looking at a competitive firm that we were talking about before, many firms know they're price takers and they face a flat demand curve, which is here shown P equals MR equals AR. You could even add an equals D, that's their demand curve. So a profit maximizing firm, competitive firm, is going to, any profit maximizing firm actually is going to produce where MR is equal to MC. That is a golden rule. Literally, if you're going to remember one thing from this review session, MR equals MC, that is always what you equate anything to find profit maximization. So here they're going to basically find MR. So it's this flat demand curve that is equal to demand is equal to price. So you know that it's this flat one and MC is right here. So they're going to choose this point and you look down and that's going to be their quantity, right? And so here in this particular case that I took from the textbook, they have average total costs that are below this MC, this point. So this actually just shows that they're going to gain profit. I hope everyone can see that, because basically they're going to be gaining this price for their good. And the difference between the price they're getting and the average total cost that they have to pay when they produce is this. So they get this much profit. So basically here, the short run, here the firm decides to produce because obviously it's going to make profits. And this is basically here in the short run, this one is making profit. So that's about it. That's just how you find where they're producing and how to find how much profit they're making. So here, this is just a little note about the short run supply curve. I don't think it's that important. Like, it's not a very big part of your course. This is just the portion of the MC curve that lies above the average variable cost. And just to find the industry supply curve, you just horizontally sum these. You must have more on this in your class notes or textbook. So this is just it. It's just right here. So I showed you guys the short run decisions. So this is how they're going to choose if they produce, and also just to see if they're making profits. So here, long run decisions. In the short run, the firm produces as long as the price is above average variable cost. They have to cover the cost of producing, basically. In the long run, however, firms are able to enter and exit the market. And so essentially, a firm that is looking from the outside of the market, basically, they're looking into the market for carrots. There's all these firms making carrots. And if a firm looking from the outside sees that these firms in the short run are making profits, why wouldn't this firm go in? There's no cost to entry. It's easy to just start your own carrot firm. So seeing that these firms are making profits, this firm is going to decide to come in. So this is my third bullet point. And so basically, what happens when a firm enters the market, or many firms, if they're seeing many profits being made, it will shift the market supply curve. So not firm supply curve, we're looking at the market. So this is market and this is each firm. So here, basically, you have supply, which basically shows all the firms in the market that are supplying. Essentially, when there are profits in the short run, a firm will decide to come in. It might be one, it might be several firms. And this will shift supply curve, because basically at every price, there are now more firms that are willing and able to supply because they were making profits before. So new firms came in and are like, okay, I'll supply too. So you have a supply shift. And basically what happens is, as we saw with market equilibriums, when there's a supply, your price decreases along the demand curve and it reaches this new equilibrium E1. What happens basically when you look at the individual firm before was producing where P, so basically where their marginal revenue is equal to price. So they normally have a flat demand curve here that is not drawn, but you have a flat demand curve here. So they're producing where MC equals MR, and they have this profit here. You can see this because their average total costs are lower than their marginal costs. So they're making this like little rectangle of profits that is not properly drawn here, but that would be their profits. So each firm is making profit. However, with this supply shift, the price is decreasing. So now their demand curve, the demand curve they're facing, since they're price takers, has shifted down. There would be a new demand curve drawn here. So now MC equals MR is now here, but this is also exactly equal to their average total costs. So that is actually equal to how much they need to be covering to be making profits. So essentially at this point, since firms have come into the market, in the long run, firms no longer make profit. And that's the whole idea behind perfect competition. Basically, eventually as the price decreases, firms will no longer be making profits. So in the long run equilibrium, every single firm in perfect competition does not make a single economic profit. They just break even essentially. And this could be happening the other way around. Basically in the short run, if a firm is making losses, it basically means that some firms might come out of the industry because they're making too many losses. And that would lead to the opposite effect, a supply shift outwards, upwards. And that would mean an increase in price. So people are no longer making losses, but making normal profit, exactly the scenario, but you'd be going from lower, for example, here, where you're making a loss. So that's basically the idea behind perfect competition. I hope that was clear. And so here, that's basically what you get to. These are the short run curves, and then the long run one is tangent. So in the long run, perfectly competitive firms are not suffering losses or making profit. They're literally just breaking even. And that's basically perfect competition. So this is a rather long practice question, but I will try to go through it relatively fast. It's all written there. You guys can access this later. So in this example, you guys are given QD, which does not change, it stays. This is market, by the way. I underlined it. This is market equilibrium. You're given these market demand curves because we know that otherwise for firm, it's just a straight curve, which this one is not. This one is not at all a straight curve, horizontal, sorry. So here you're given two supply curves. So that would be what would happen if a firm were to come in because in the short run, a firm is making profits and is attracted to the market. So basically what you would do is I would first find the short run and long run market equilibrium. So you know first you want to equate QD to QS0. So I did this here. It gives you P0 equal to 20, Q0 is equal to 80. Then to find the long run one, you would equate QD to QS1 since QD has not changed. So this would give you different price, 15, and Q1, 85. So essentially, it could be exactly this, what happened. You could put 80 here, 85 here, and I can't remember the prices, but it decreased. I think it was 20 and 15. No, 20 and 15, amazing. So that could be the case that happened right there. That would perfectly represent that. So to find the firm's profit maximizing point in the short run, what you do is easily, you know that MC is just Q here, and you're given MR since MR is just the price. Well, you're not given it, you find it basically. So in the short run, you know that QD is equal to QS, you know that it's equal to this point E0, you know P here. So you're given that you find this price by equating, and then you know that MR is basically this curve here for the individual firm. So you know that MR is actually equal to your P, which is 20, which is also equal to MC. So your price in the short run is equal to P0 is equal to 20, which is also equal to MC MR. So this is your profit maximizing point. And you also know that Q0 is that's your profit maximizing point. So in the long run, however, profit maximization is again MC equals MR. However, your price has changed. So this would just change to 15. So that's basically what this question asks you. There we go. Oh yes, so this chapter 10 is now looking at a monopoly. So this is another part that people do not like at all. Total revenue is price on quantity. Again, it's the same formulas I put as before. So these are just, you can just look at them in your own time. However, here, the demand curve facing a monopolist is not at all flat like a perfect competitive firm. Basically here, the demand curve is downward sloping. They are price makers, they have an influence. So monopoly is basically one or two or maybe three firms, not usually, it's usually one dominating firm in a market, and you might have a few small firms, or it might literally be the only one in the market. So this one has a huge market share, and so they're able to set their price and dictate what price is going to be the price that goods sell at. So basically their demand curve is downward sloping, and the MR is not constant nor equal to the price. So it's actually downward sloping as well. And I think, yeah, there we go. This is their demand curve. And then the MR is actually half the slope. And it's basically just inwards here. So you can see it's half the slope because the x-axis intersects here 100 and half here 50. So that's the MR. These are just some like little diagrams you guys can look at. So basically here, this would also be equal to D. So that's the demand curve. So this is what a monopoly sees. They see their demand curve, they see their MR curve. And so as I said before, the profit maximizing thing is MC equals MR. So that's a really important part. So a firm will always produce if it exceeds its average variable cost, and it will produce where MC equals MR. That is the most important thing. So basically, MC equals MR is this point here. So unlike a perfectly competitive firm here, this firm has power in the market. So here it's going to basically choose this quantity. That's how it sets its quantity. But then to choose its price, it's actually going to look up to its demand curve, not the MR curve. It's going to look up to the demand curve. This is what people are willing to pay for their goods. Basically, this demand curve is basically their power. They're able to set this price. So this is the PS. This is basically what they're going to set. And as you can see, this is much above their average cost curve. So essentially, they're making this much profit. So yeah, at this quantity, the monopoly will charge a price. And basically P is greater than ATC, so the monopoly makes economics profits. So that will always be, mostly be the case. So here it makes profits. Oops. Then here, competition versus monopoly, this is where the big difference comes into place, because basically, as seen, the perfectly competitive firm, the market sets its price at PC, which is the most allocatively and productively efficient, because it is where supply intersects with demand. However, a monopoly, since it has power, is able to set their price much higher than a perfectly competitive firm. As you can see, PM is much higher than PC. And they're also going to produce much less quantity than a perfectly competitive firm, QM. So that's going to lead to this like deadweight loss, basically. Essentially, a perfectly competitive firm is much more efficient, and that's why monopoly is often not desired in any kind of industry, because it is able to charge much higher prices and also provides much less quantity. So I think I covered everything in this slide. Yes, exactly. So basically in monopolies, the only way monopolies are actually able to keep their profits in the long run is they prevent firms from entering, because obviously if the entry of firms was able to happen, it would resemble much more a perfectly competitive market where lots and lots of firms come in, they're all able to share the market, and then monopolies would not have their market share as big. So this is basically how monopolies keep their profits. They basically make sure that there are barriers to entry. And so a barrier could be very natural. I mean, I think Hydro-Quebec is an example of one that has a natural barrier. They make energy, and the costs involved with being a rival to Hydro-Quebec are so high that basically no other firm competes with Hydro-Quebec. And then also entry barriers can be created by conscious government actions. If there is any sort of thing that protects a monopoly and the good they've produced, basically a monopoly will be produced, since it will be much harder for competitors to compete with this good, since they might not be able to use the same technology as the previous firm. So that's basically the idea behind monopolies. Yes, a very good big thing that can happen with monopoly power is the formation of cartels. So essentially, cartels, it happens when a group of firms mutually agree to act as a monopoly. So it might not be the case that there's actually a monopoly in the market, but maybe 4 or 5 firms decide to cooperate and act as a monopoly. This way they can charge much higher prices. So OPEC is an example for this. So they will decide how much to produce, usually the monopoly level, and this allows them to set the price at the monopoly level. So here, as you can see, if the firms were alone, they would literally just be producing this quantity, since they don't have huge market share and market power, so they'd be producing this quantity. However, if they decide to all cooperate together and act as one firm, they can basically profit maximize by setting MC equals MR, which would be here, because they'd be acting as a monopoly, so that they have an MR curve, which is not here, which would not be equivalent to their demand curve like a price taking firm, but a price making firm would have a downward sloping MR curve such that they can choose this quantity here, and then they can charge this price. So this would be the output that they choose as an industry. So this is the whole industry, this is the individual firm. So the whole industry would be doing capital Q1 at P1. Essentially, this is a much higher price and smaller quantity. However, the problem with cartels is that there is always an incentive to cheat, essentially, because basically Q1 is the overall industry output. So here, lower base, so little small q, is now the firm level of output. So let's say Q1 is divided by 3 firms, and they each make Q1. So small q1 here means that at this price, the ATC is what their costs are. And essentially they're making this much profit, which is pretty decent. At P1, they're making this like rectangle of profit, each firm, much better than what they would be making if they did not act as a monopoly. However, at this price, P1, each firm is actually incentivized to produce where MC is equal to this price. Because this way, actually, they would be able to produce Q2, so much, much more quantity at this same price, because basically in their cartel, they've decided to set price at P1, so they know that competitors are going to keep selling at P1, so it's not as if they have competitors with lower prices, so they can afford to put P1, and they can produce much more. So basically, they'd be making this much profit, because here their ATC is a bit higher, but still, this is much bigger than this rectangle. So basically each firm has an incentive to cheat basically and produce more than they'd agreed upon. However, obviously as more and more of them produce, this changes everything because there's more quantity available in the market such that the price eventually starts to decrease and they actually come back to their original point where they were not colluding. So that's basically the risk in cartels. So they're great they're great for the firms if they work, but if they don't work, if they don't cooperate and if they do cheat, then they do not work. So that's the danger in cartels there. Concerning monopolies, a big thing firms with power will do is that they will price discriminate. So that's a big part of this chapter. So requirements to price discriminate are market power, different consumer evaluations, and ability to prevent resale. These are important because obviously you need to have market power to be able to change your price. And you need different consumer evaluations because essentially you need your whole consumer base to have, some of them will have very inelastic demand, some of them will have very elastic. So you need different elasticities because some people will value a good more than others and will be willing to pay more than others. So that's basically a requirement. And the ability to prevent resale is extremely important because basically if you sell a good more expensive to one person and cheaper to another, you have to avoid the person that bought it cheaper to be able to go sell that to other people for more expensive, basically. So there are different types of price discrimination. You have it among units of output. So a firm attempts to capture as much consumer surplus as possible by charging different prices. I don't know if I have a diagram of that. No, I do not. But essentially, what they would be doing is that for different units, they charge different prices. And so if you charge for the first 10 units, let's say 20, you would be getting as much every time. If you do different prices, you can get as much of this consumer surplus as possible. I know your textbook and probably your lecture slides have much better explanations for that, so you guys can look back at that. But basically the idea is that they capture as much consumer surplus as possible. Then you have price discrimination among market segments, and this is the easiest one basically. Basically, you can distinguish consumers by age, where consumers live. So you could be selling things more expensive basically in the US than in Canada. And that obviously the border is a huge deterrent to people reselling. And so basically that's how you can avoid, and by age easy, you only sell at a certain price to some people. And basically if you were to resell, like people, if it's like, let's say concert ticket, if they got a specific discounted ticket, easily you just ask them for their age, and that's how you could prevent people that are older getting a cheaper ticket, for example, something like that. So that's the whole idea behind this. And then a firm with market power that can identify distinct market segments will maximize profits. So yeah, they'll basically, you do this by charging a higher price to those with less elastic demand. Basically the idea behind less elastic demand, as I explained, is that as you increase the price, the quantity demanded changes less for those people because they are willing to pay that. They don't mind the price increasing as much. They won't change their quantity demanded as much. So those are the best people to charge the higher price to. Now, hurdle pricing is another way of price discriminating. This is often used by airlines, for example. It makes the most impatient ones pay, essentially. For example, if you go visit a website 5 times for flights, the price will increase. And that's basically because they know you are the most interested. They know your demand is much less elastic. Or even, for example, if you have a flight for the next day and you want to buy that one, obviously the price will be much, much higher than if you bought it 2 weeks earlier because they know you are much more desperate to get that good, so they can afford to put the price much, much higher. So that's the whole idea behind price discrimination. This is just basically a thing that shows the different valuations of people, obviously less elastic and more elastic. So consequences of price discrimination. It will always provide the firm with higher profits. If they are able to maximize the price they're giving to certain people, they will always get higher profits. Because obviously, if they can make sure that people that are willing to pay higher, and those that aren't, they can make sure to have different prices and not an average price that will just be a bit less efficient for them. This is the whole idea that basically price discrimination really helps them. They can increase total output and there will be more surplus in the market, and basically the whole outcome is much more efficient. It's the whole idea that also they can capture more consumer surplus as well. This is a very easy practice question. Basically, it's the idea that group A and group B are two different groups, and you can discriminate against between them, maybe by age. Group A has a much more elastic demand curve than B, and firms will obviously choose B to discriminate against because group B has a more elastic demand curve. So what I said, they respond less strongly to a price change. So they would be the ones where you would increase the price for them. Oh, we're getting towards the end, guys. So sorry, this is so long. I'm literally just talking at you for 2 hours. So yeah, now this is the one with the whole firms thing. This is one of the last chapters on it. Basically, we looked at perfect competition and monopoly. Now imperfect competition is looking at close to perfect competition, but just how you change the requirements, basically the assumptions. In perfect competition monopoly basically barely exists. You basically never have a place where all the firms make the exact same product. For example, in perfect competition, you also really have a place where there are so many firms and there's perfect information, so people know exactly what the other firms are doing. So basically those are pretty rare. So what happens more often is monopolistically competitive firms, and those basically are firms, I'll go into those after, and then you also have oligopolies. And so yeah, these firms have differentiated products. So basically, let's look, a good example of monopolistically competitive firm is a restaurant. So obviously all restaurants they might make similar foods, but they're all quite different. And because they're quite different, they are able to set a price to some degree. And most of those actually, to be able to compete, because it's often, especially in monopolistically competitive markets, there's still a lot of firms. So the only way they're really able to distinguish themselves, because they don't want to be having like very different prices to their competitors, because otherwise people would easily go buy to the cheapest one. So what they do is they engage in non-price competition, which is a lot. For example, advertising is the main example of this. If you think shoe producers are an example of monopolistically competitive firms. If you think about it, Nike is a big one. How do they differentiate themselves so much is by advertising, for example, and creating a brand. So monopolistically competitive firms, the assumption is that there are differentiated products. Each firm has access to the same technology. No firm has a direct effect on other firms, and there's no barriers to entry, exit. So in the short run, a monopolistically competitive firm maximizes profits like a monopoly. Again, like any other firm, MC equals MR. In the long run, however, it's very similar to perfect competition. There are no profits, and that's because firms are able to enter and exit. And as we saw, that affects supply in the market, and that ultimately affects the price in the individual firm diagram like this. So in the short run, here, as you can see, MC equals MR, this is how they choose their output. And then you look up and they're gonna fit it to their demand curve. And this is how you see they have some profits. However, because firms are able to enter and exit in the long run, you can't see the market graph here, but imagine the market graphs I showed you guys before, supply and demand intersect. If more and more firms come in, supply shift will increase, will move, meaning there is less demand. And so eventually what we'll get is that you'll get to a point where MC equals MR here. But this point is now that in the long run, the cost curve is tangent to it, such that they are making no more profit, basically. What often happens here actually as well in this kind of market is that there's excess capacity. Basically, excess capacity is where MC intersects here. And basically this is where LRAC is minimized. It's basically the lowest point. It's like lowest costs, basically. And so where this intersects marginal costs is where it's the most efficient. And basically most firms do not produce here. There's this excess capacity that is not used up. And if you think about it, it's the case that when you go into a restaurant, often not all the tables will be used. That's a really good example of excess capacity. So yeah, that's basically monopolistically competitive firms. So then you have an oligopoly. So this is basically where you have a few firms that control, so maybe 2 or more, that control most of the market. So here, oligopolies act in a very strategic way. So basically, the actions of a firm directly affect other firms in the industry. And firms can either maximize joint profits or compete to maximize their own profits. So that's the whole idea. And this is how game theory comes in, because oligopolies really have to take into account the decisions of their competitors to maximize their own profits. So here, when you look at game theory, this is a payoff matrix. You must have seen those of these. Basically, the idea behind this is that you have cooperate or compete, cooperate and compete. And basically, to be able to work these, I'm not sure if anyone is like very familiar with these. What I do is basically you fix firm A's decision, they decide to cooperate. So you look at, they could make 20, 15. Considering that firm A cooperates, you have to look at what firm B would choose. You know that firm A cooperates, what does firm B do as a result? They could either cooperate as well, get 20, or they could compete and get 22. They're obviously going to choose 22, that's higher than 20. So that's what they choose, that's why I circled it. Again, you fix compete, firm A decides to compete. Now what does firm B do? 15 or 17, they choose 17. So you do that the other way around. Firm B cooperates, what does firm A do? 20 or 22, 22. Firm B competes, well, considering firm B competes, what does firm A do? Again, they choose 15 or 17, they choose 17. And so basically the Nash equilibrium is where both of them have the common interest. And here it's actually to both compete. And the Nash equilibrium is basically a prisoner's dilemma in a sense, because both of them choose to do something that actually does not maximize their joint profits. Basically here they have a joint profit of 34, which they could actually get a joint profit of 40 here. So that's the whole idea behind game theory. Both firms compete, but they could produce a joint higher level of output if they decided to cooperate. So that's the main problem behind oligopolies. So oligopolies in practice, when firms agree to cooperate, it is often called collusion. So there's explicit cooperation or non-explicit. And so that's basically the idea that they both choose to cooperate, just assuming that the other one is going to also cooperate because it is in their mutual interest. So firms in an oligopoly often choose to compete. And so what they do is that because they have this specific market share and they do so through pricing and advertising, product quality or innovation. The big one is often advertising. You can see that in many firms like Nike, whatever. And then also through pricing, this is obviously they're going to try undercut, they're competing, they're going to undercut their rivals' price. And usually from anything competition wise, consumers always benefit, because if it's going to be through pricing, they're often going to get lower prices. If it's through advertising, this is probably at the expense of the other one. So the other one might choose to decrease prices. So it's often consumers benefit from this. Obviously product quality, if one of them decides they want to make a higher quality product at the other's expense, it's going to help consumers. So usually consumers benefit from this. And so what oligopolies also do is to be able to keep this market power and the profits they're making, they need to implement entry barriers like a monopoly. And so what they often do is brand proliferation, because obviously if you create a brand like Coca-Cola, everyone knows about Coca-Cola, it's extremely hard for a new firm to come in, even if they make a product as good as Coca-Cola. The advertising that Coca-Cola has built over the years just is such a huge deterrent for any other firm to join the market. That's how it's going to stop other firms coming in. So it does it through brand proliferation, advertising. Predatory pricing refers to the fact that these big firms, they've amassed so many profits and they can also afford to make losses for like a year or two. So if they know another firm's going to join, they might really decrease the prices such that other firms cannot come in just because they cannot afford with the cost that they incur to come in. That's the idea. Here's an example. What conditions? I said barriers to entry. That's how oligopolies keep long run profits. And then using the payoff matrix, I showed you guys how to do it before, so I'm not going to go through it. But essentially the Nash equilibrium is here. And it's where both of them are making 6. Oh, sorry, I went chapter 12. I saw the question. Sorry, I'm just going to look at it. Is predatory pricing illegal anywhere? I actually have no idea. I think if it can be proven that it is to deter other firms, possibly, but I really think it's quite hard to prove that, because I think a firm could just decide to decrease their prices. I don't know how you, I'm not entirely sure. I'm so sorry. I do not know for that. But I think if it could, oh, there we go. Someone answered it's illegal in Canada. So I think the fact that if it can be proven to be to like deter others from entering, then if it can be proven that it's for that purpose, then yes, I would assume that it can be illegal. And someone just said it was in Canada. So yes. So yeah, here I went through it. Like you look, if airline B raises its price, what does airline A do? And then you just find out that they do the lowering price, both of them, which actually hurts them because they could be getting 20 million instead of 12 million jointly. So that's the idea behind that. Okay, chapter 12, we are close to the end. I'm so sorry, I might just go over by like 5 minutes, I'm not sure. So productive and allocative efficiency. I touched on that very briefly, but basically productive efficiency is basically for the firm must be producing its output at the lowest possible cost. That's just how that works. And then for the industry, the marginal cost of production must be the same for each firm. So basically productive efficiency, I also mentioned at the very beginning, if firms and industries are productively efficient, the economy will be on rather than inside the PPP. It's basically the idea is that you're productively efficient, you're using your resources as much as possible and productively. So that's it, you'd be on your PPP. Allocative efficiency refers to basically you want the output of each good is such that its market price is equal to the margin cost. You want P to equal MC. And basically, not many firms, markets do that. So basically, perfect competition is the only one where both of them they're productively and allocatively efficient, because as you remember, P equals MC, and they're productively efficient because they're producing output at the lowest possible cost. Monopoly, they're productively efficient, but P is greater than MC. As we saw, they make profits. So it is not allocatively efficient. Monopolistic competition, oligopoly, they're productively efficient, but they're not allocatively efficient. So that's basically it. We have some more consumer and producer surplus. So in a perfect competition, you have, it's maximized basically. Consumer surplus is as big as it can be, producer surplus as well. In a monopoly, that is not the case. Here, because they choose MC equals MR, they choose to produce QM. This means a price PM. So basically producers are getting this whole area of producer surplus, and consumers, since they're paying this price, they're getting this consumer surplus. So this leaves this area as before. I think I also showed it before. There's basically a deadweight loss to society. So that's why often government will try go against monopolies since they are not efficient. And this is, economic regulation. This is what I was talking about. Basically, market failures occur when market economies fail to produce efficient outcomes. As I showed, a monopoly is a case of that. So a natural monopoly is the clearest case for public intervention. So this is where the government can intervene. So regulation, the government can assume ownership of the firm. At least that way you can know that the government can make sure there are no profits. And if there are profits, actually going to the government. So it's actually going back to the people, essentially, hopefully. You can also allow private ownership, but you regulate the monopoly's behavior. So basically you can do marginal cost pricing, two-part tariffs, or average cost pricing. I'll go into both the other ones. Two-part tariffs is basically consumer pays one price to gain access to the product and a second price for each unit consumed. That's what two-part tariff is. Marginal cost pricing, basically it's where the price is set to MC, which is what we saw was allocatively efficient. So that's how they would do this. So they set it here. However, often the outcome is, well, obviously, as I said, allocatively efficient, but the monopoly suffers losses. So unless the government is able to offset this is obviously sometimes not ideal. Then you have average cost pricing. This is basically where you allow the monopoly to basically produce where it's going to just cover its costs. So here it's just going to cover the costs it needs to cover to be able to produce. And here it's just going to break even basically. So that's another way of making, to regulate a monopoly. However, this is not allocatively efficient because as you can see, P is not at all equal to MC. There's a big difference here. So yeah, those are just ways of regulating a monopoly to make them just a bit better basically. So this is just a bit about Canadian competition policy. I'm not going to go into it. I think you guys have more on this in your notes from the textbook and lectures. But basically, as someone mentioned in the chat as well, there are ways to avoid monopolies and colluding or whatever. So there's rules on unfair trade practices. Also, a lot of companies will not be allowed to merge, because obviously if two big companies or even one big, one small merge, it means that overall the merger is going to have much more power in the market, and that could lead to a monopoly situation. So yeah, those are just things to look at. So this is, this is a little practice thing. Basically, as we saw, if the marginal cost producing the last unit is the same for all firms in the industry, we know it's productively efficient. You guys will have an open book exam, so you guys can just look that up if you guys have a similar question. But with just knowing the marginal cost, we don't know enough about the allocatively efficiency of this thing. And then what point on the graph exhibits inefficiency? So basically, as I showed at the very beginning, A, B, C are productively efficient. This is not efficient, because basically D to A to B to C, you could be producing, from D to A, for example, you could be getting more pizza and more sugar. So this is obviously not efficient, because they could be using the resources much better to be able to produce more pizza and more sugar. And E is just not attainable. So, I mean, I think some of you do trade in like one of your section of Econ 208. So you guys might have looked at that. Basically with trade, you will be able to attain this, but you won't be able to produce it. You'll just be able to consume at this level. Basically, you'll be either importing some pizza or some sugar from another country. So yeah, that's just not attainable in this economy with the resources this economy has. Okay, we're on the last chapter, guys. So this, I think, is one of the shorter ones. Basically, chapter 16 looks at the role of the government in the case for free markets. The government has a monopoly on violence, as you guys may have seen in your textbook. Basically, if this is used in a way that's secure and is not just used arbitrarily and it's for the safety of citizens, this is fine. That's probably a case where monopoly is not bad, so that people don't have access to violence easily. So the formal case for free markets is based on allocative efficiency, because basically free markets provide automatic coordination of actions of decentralized decision makers. Free markets work really well because they basically coordinate households and firms and basically demands and supplies. So it's just very easy. You don't have to have someone that tells firms to produce this much and households to produce this much. It just kind of happens with its price. When price changes, when demand and supply changes, and they just kind of work. And then another one, the pursuit of profits in free markets provides a stimulus, because obviously if there is the chance of making profits, firms will decide to innovate. They will decide to make better quality products, etc. That's how free markets work. So they provide a stimulus. And then free markets also permit a decentralization of economic power. Yeah, the whole thing that basically when you're looking at command economy, like for example, the Soviet Union, it was the Soviet Union that decided what was going to be produced by who. Free markets basically allow this not to be, like, it doesn't have to be decided by one person, which would make it very complicated in our kind of like day and age, basically. So yeah, market failures, however, do arise, and that is because of market power. It is due to externalities. I'll touch on them super briefly. Basically, externalities is when the external cost of a good is not included in the price you pay for it. So a good example of this, let's say, is negative consumption externality, for example, is cigarettes. When you smoke a cigarette, you get a marginal benefit. So you get this demand curve, marginal benefit. And however, the price you're paying for the cigarette does not include the cost, the indirect cost that you are causing by smoking that cigarette. You might be exposing other people to your smoke. Especially, you might also yourself be at higher risk of cancer, and that's basically an indirect cost on healthcare. So on the government, basically. So that's the whole idea of externalities. You have external costs. There's a chat. Is smoking cigarettes really marginal benefit? Private marginal benefit it is, because the good does bring the person, I mean, I hope, I'm guessing people that are smoking cigarettes are doing it for their benefit. When they are smoking, they get their own private marginal benefit. And that's the whole thing of this negative consumption externalities. It doesn't take into account the social marginal benefit, basically. Well, no, not marginal benefit, just the marginal cost. So yeah, that's basically it. Whoever just commented, yeah, I'm glad it helped. Yeah. But yeah, so basically externalities is just basically your private marginal cost or private marginal benefit does not include the social cost. Basically, an example of a positive one, for example, let's say a vaccine. You obviously, when you get a vaccine, you get a private marginal benefit, which is basically that you are now immune to the disease. So that is your private marginal benefit, and that's the demand curve. However, in the price you pay for that vaccine, there are you don't include the social marginal benefit of it. Basically, there are huge benefits to society of you getting the vaccine. For example, when you get the vaccine, there's the herd immunity aspect. So basically other people may be immune even if they're not getting it. Also, if you are immune, you will not get sick. You will not impose costs on the healthcare. So that's a whole thing that the price you're paying for a vaccine does not include these benefit costs. And so all that, basically a free market does not include these externality costs, whether they're good or bad if they're consumption or production. So basically that's the whole aspect, that there are market failures just because the free market doesn't include these. And then a really important part is non-frivolous and non-excludable goods. Sorry, I'm going to go as fast as possible. I guarantee it'll be done before 2:10. Sorry, not 2:10. 10 past 8. So basically non-frivolous and non-excludable goods. This is super important because private goods, I hope you guys, it's an open book exam, so you guys can look these up. Private good is basically frivolous and excludable. Basically, you have to pay for it. That's how it's excludable. And also when you consume it, it's gone. You cannot, other people can't benefit for it. If you buy an apple, you pay a price for it. Other people are excluded from it. And when you eat it, the apple is gone. Nobody can have it after you've eaten it. Public goods are goods that are non-excludable and non-rival. And that basically means that these are often not supplied by the free market, because public goods, basically anyone can have access to them and you cannot put a price on it, because it's basically a lamppost. You cannot control who passes under it. You cannot control who benefits from it. And also one person doesn't exclude another person from having it. So the whole idea is that these goods will not be provided by the free market, because no one will have an incentive to produce them, because they cannot get a price for it. They do not know who to get the money from for them. So that's the whole idea behind public goods. So usually that's where the government comes in to place. That's why most economies are mixed economies. Basically, you need the government to come in and provide lampposts. You need the government to come in to provide national defense, because basically no one's going to pay for the military otherwise. If you were just to ask people for money, yeah. So the government through taxes comes in and provides these goods for people, which is a benefit to everyone. It's just impossible for the free market to provide them, basically. Another big problem is common property resources. These include fisheries, for example, common access fisheries, sorry. This is because these goods are non-excludable. You cannot stop people from getting access to them. You can't stop people from just getting access to the sea and taking a boat. You could, because there's a price involved with getting a boat, but there isn't a direct price you can put on it. And then, however, they are rivalrous. Basically, when you fish in a common access fishery, you are taking fish out. Once you take that fish is no longer there. It will come back eventually in the long run, but right then, you are depleting it. So basically, common property resources, it's often called the tragedy of the commons, because these sources are often depleted and no one can put a cost on them, because you can't exclude people from having them. So often the government comes in again and tries to control these. Club goods, those are quite easy. Those are excludable just because you put a price on them. A club good could basically be a golf club. You are paying to be part of the golf club. However, it's non-frivolous really, because many people can play golf, basically. So that's an example of market failure, because these goods, some of them are okay. Private goods and club goods can be provided by the free market because you can put a price on them, but the others you cannot. So that's how market failure occurs. Another type of market failure is asymmetric information. That's really important. Moral hazard is basically when, a good example of this is insurance-wise. If now you are insured, your car is insured against damage, you might act in a more reckless way. You might get into more car accidents just because you know you are insured. So that's a moral hazard. You're going to change your behavior based on insurance, for example. So that's a market failure, because the insurance company did not take that into account and gave you insurance and did not know you would start becoming more reckless. Adverse selection is also an example of this. The whole example is a seller has a really bad quality car they're trying to sell to a consumer. the consumer does not have perfect information. They do not know that this car is a rotten car. So this is adverse selection because the informed party is able to cheat the uninformed party. Basically, that's an example of market failure. So government intervention will happen, public provision, as I said, of public goods, national defense, highways, lampposts, whatever. Redistribution programs might occur to counteract any effects of market failures. Regulation, yeah, that's to limit market power. And then government intervention, yes, it is costly always. So there are direct costs because they do use resources to do it. And then there are also indirect costs because once the government intervenes, you can also get market failure from government intervention just because they have now changed the whole market aspect. So that's more in this case of market powers or externalities. They will change. There'll be a cost of production that may have changed, a cost of compliance to comply with government intervention, whatever. And then I think this is our last example. So this is cool. So is commercial fishing an example of a public good, private good, club good, or common property? It's a private good. The example is a bit misleading because there's fishing, and I mentioned common access fisheries. Here, the important aspect to keep in mind is the commercial. Commercial means that it's fishing for profit. It's these people that are specialized in fishing. They have not a fishing firm, but a firm that fishes, and they are fishing for profit. So they will go out and fish, and they sell on the market for a price. What a common access resource is where you don't know that the person is going fishing and they're just going fishing. And usually commercial fishing as well will have to pay licenses to go fish. So that's a private good, basically. Whenever you're selling good for a price, it's not going to be a public good because it's impossible to set a price on a public good or a common access resource, basically. Then if you hide the fact that you've been in many car accidents from a car insurance agent, this is an example of what type of asymmetric information. I actually not struggle with this one, but there's a clear distinction with adverse selection and moral hazard. And this is the fact that adverse selection is when decisions are made based on incomplete information. Moral hazard is then that you change your behavior based on a decision that's been made. So adverse selection is really the fact that one person is uninformed. So in this case, you've had many car accidents. You do not tell your car insurance. Your car insurance is going to give you a much lower price than if they knew you'd been in many car accidents before. If the question was, you have now been given car insurance, you now have many more car accidents. What's this an example of? That would be moral hazard because you're now changing behavior based on the fact that you have insurance. So yeah, that is literally all for me. I am so sorry that was long, but I really hope that helped. If you guys have any questions, you guys can stay and just ask me, or if you want any in the chat, that's perfect. This will be available as soon as possible. And yeah, if you guys have any other questions, just stay a bit longer. And yeah, I can see all your messages in the chat. That's super nice. I'm glad this helped. Yeah, and if you guys have any questions as well, you can always text the ESA and they have my details. So you can, if you guys really want extra help or anything. But yeah, I'm really glad that helped, guys.